So good morning, everybody. My name is Luc Girardin. I'm the head of chapter for Europe at Columbia Venture Community. Very happy to host today this panel where we are going to talk about growth strategy and compare actually the different strategies between the United States and Europe. First I would like to give you a short overview on the Columbia Venture Community for those who don't know about it. So Columbia Venture Community has been created in 2006, actually before startup and entrepreneurship was as popular as it is now. It's a very popular community inside Columbia alumni. We have, I think, more than 5,000 members around the world. It's a very active community, mostly in the US, also in the UK, in Asia. We are now building the chapter in Europe. And this webinar is part of that effort. So our mission is to foster entrepreneurship among Columbia alumni, university alumni, students, and staff by facilitating communication, providing access to needed resources, and creating vibrant and supportive communities. So we really try to help Columbia alumni around the world, wherever they are in the entrepreneurial area, so both on the investor side and the entrepreneur side. So as I mentioned, we have approximately 6,000 members. We're present in 50 plus countries. We're the #1 alumni-led group in Columbia entrepreneurship and innovation ecosystem. Maybe next slide. So in Europe, before I talk about the upcoming events, we are now trying to build a chapter here locally. We have started earlier this year, and obviously our plans have been a little bit disrupted via COVID. So we started actually building connection at the beginning of the year. Initially, we had a localized approach, primarily in Germany and France, and we are moving more to an event-driven approach, where we want rather to bring people together around topics or industries, for instance, biotech, or AI, or fundraising or growth, rather than looking country by country. But so far, we've been mostly active in France and Germany. We started to build partnership with key players like France Digital, for instance, or Station F. And now CVC also moved to a fully digital model. So we are also moving in that direction, and that's why we are starting to host these kind of events. So as part of these events hosted by CVC, you can check this upcoming event on the 8th of July around investing during a global crisis with Janie Fielding, who is Textile Managing Director. So after this short intro, I would like to get into today's topics and introduce our panelists. Actually, we have one of them who seemed to have had an issue this morning, or might not be able to join. Maybe he might be able to join later, but we will see actually how that unfolds. So Matan Griffel was supposed to join, but not too sure if he will be able to do so. He had a last-minute emergency. He's the co-founder and CEO of Ophelia, which is a company that helps people quit opioid, active mostly in Pennsylvania. So he's US-based. He's also an adjunct assistant professor at Columbia Business School. He's also an innovation fellow at Lung Center. So he's a really renowned growth hacker in the US, so received numerous awards. He was, for instance, part of the Forbes 30 Under 30 list. We also have Jordan Chenevier, who is the Chief Marketing Officer of Germinal, based in France. So Germinal is a company based in Paris over France and Europe that advise clients, which are both startup and corporate, in their growth journey. So it's really helping them bring more revenue, bring more customers. Germinal work with more than 250 companies. Prior to that, Jordan was a co-founder at Loha, which is a platform around artistic skills. So basically connecting artists with people who need them. He's also a speaker in a number of business schools, for instance, I should say in Paris. And we have also with us Chris Rodriguez from IXL. He's a founder and growth marketer there. So basically, Chris is a veteran in digital marketing and growth hacking, having more than 15 years of experience in the area. So he helps companies build operational growth plans to achieve tangible growth numbers. He worked on advised more than 30 companies across all funding stages and sizes to generate more customer revenues. So he's been supporting 3 exits on the manage significant growth levels at his clients. And there is also a real recognized growth hacking expert in the US, featured in a number of panels on the speaker at a number of events. So I see actually that Matan has been joining. Matan, you are just on time. I've been introducing you, and we can actually start the conversation. So growth hacking in the US versus Europe. So of course, the US and Europe are very different environments in terms of legal framework. We have, let's say, around 30 countries in Europe, on just one in the US. We have language diversity. We have different regulations, for instance, in terms of data on GDPR. We have also different access to capitals and funding modes. We have also different cultures when it comes to entrepreneurship. So I would like now really to discuss the main factors that lead to differences in startup growth strategies. What, in your view, is really the things that make growth hacking different in the US versus Europe?
You should start.
Yes, well, first off, thank you, Luc, and the group for having me and Jordan and Matan here today. I know the first thought that comes to mind here is clearly the difference in privacy from the EU versus the US. And I know that Jordan and I were joking just yesterday about how different our experiences are because of just that. So Jordan, you can clearly speak to your day-to-days there with GDPR. I think that's a great place to start.
Yeah, so I would like to say thank you also as well. So I'm really pleased to be here and chatting with you guys today. So yeah, in Europe, one of the main concern is, as you just mentioned, GDPR. That is like a set of rules that we are not as free as you guys are in the US in terms of privacy. And I think, we have a lot of discussions actually with our clients and even internally with my colleagues regarding GDPR and the state of privacy, etc. Because everybody feels that in the Europe, everybody wants more and more privacy. I would say that I am not completely sure because I don't know if everybody understands the impact of all the what can be done on the internet and etc. Like for example, the term cookies. I'm not sure like people really understand what it is. Yeah, so I think this is one of the main thing when you want to build a growth strategy. You have to have this in mind, like the GDPR. What can you do? What cannot be done? What people want to be able to do, like for example, when you build a website, you have to let people get in touch with you if they want to ask you to remove all the data that you have about them, all these type of things, and you don't want to get into legal troubles. So it's a lot of work when building the strategy. And I think I'll let you speak for the US, but I think these type of concerns, you don't have the same thing in mind when you build a strategy.
No,
mainly,
that's correct. I would agree with that. The reason why I feel this is an advantage, sure, for U.S. marketers and companies looking to grow would be, the simple statement is GDPR adds an additional step, if you will, an additional protection layer. And anytime there is something added, your conversion rates are affected negatively. You're adding yet another blocker to the process. So fortunately, for US companies and clients that I've worked with, they've been predominantly focused on the US market. That said, when we have had some success gaining international traffic and customers, this has been the very first topic we needed to consider. How can we consider GDPR privacy? How is that going to affect our performance internationally? So this is very real and very tangible for anyone with a website that gets any international traffic, I would say.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't have too much experience actually in Europe, unfortunately. What I would say is that even in the US market, over the last few years, what has changed is that you have to be a lot more considerate towards the long run sustainability of the various strategies you're using. So people have gotten pretty tired of a lot of the tactics that had initially worked for startups early in the days. And I think the US has started cracking down more and more, although there are some things that, I think it's unfortunate people still do, like adding people to mailing lists and not really following like, canned spam laws. Startups can get away from it, can get away with not doing it, but it's not something I really recommend doing because a few startups have gotten in trouble for it, and the repercussions of being called out or caught for doing that is worse. Generally, consumers are just better informed. So I think it's just about thinking about the long run sustainability of the various tactics you're trying to use.
It's funny you mentioned that because another topic that came up just yesterday preparing for this was the cultural differences. So to your point of things like copywriting, things like what is culturally relevant in one country, the US may not be nearly as in another market and vice versa. So that is something that I personally underthought until it was highlighted to me, the other perspective. So yet another factor to consider, things as simple as the ad creative, etc. Yeah.
Well, yeah, basically as you mentioned, like even though you have different states, even though the culture in all of the states can be sometimes different, in Europe, it's way bigger. Like the differences are way bigger. Why? Because first, we don't speak the same languages between all our different states if we use the same kind of vocabulary. And so the culture is really different, and everything is so different. So we were speaking like in terms of scaling. It was also something that was coming in our discussion yesterday, and I know we will speak about scaling a little bit later in the conversation. But when you build your strategy and the way you define your strategy is really influenced by this, like the fact that you will have to build a really different strategy if you are based in France and you want to go to Spain or Germany or in the UK, etc. So this is a really big influence. And also regarding, the state of GDPR, etc. Even though in Europe we have the European Union, still countries are really independent. And so you have to know the big differences in terms of legal actions and all this regarding the different countries. So, it's like for you, when you try to launch, it's like, I think for people in the US thinking like, all right, we are going to launch Europe. for us, when we want to launch a new country in Europe, it's kind of the same effort, you know. It's a big influence when building a strategy, and also because of this, one of the influence that we have is like the difference between a private and public ecosystem in Europe and in the US. One of the few examples is that, like in terms of healthcare, this type of thing, like it's really different in Europe versus US, and the way you think about, for example, just it's kind of macro, but the way you think about capitalism versus socialism, for example. And in France, for example, we have like the Socialist Party, that is like a really big party. And the way we think about, you know, capitalism and advertising and blah, 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 it's not, we don't have the same history. And so people really feel different about companies selling things to them, Europe versus the US, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. In the US, you never have to think state by state specific strategies. Well, I'm in healthcare right now, so that's a little different. There are statewide regulations, so we have to think about expanding into states, but most startups you don't. And typically startups don't have to think about internationalization until their Series B and beyond. So, you know, 2 or 3 years in, Jordan, I imagine you have to think about internationalization from the beginning, right?
Yeah. And yeah, and you can speak about the healthcare system, I guess, because of your company. But yeah, I don't really know the healthcare system in the US, but I know this is like a really complex. But I think what's even more complicated is the fact that you have one country with differences in between the states, where in Europe, anyway, it's different countries. So everybody knows it's going to be different from one country to another. Like you already know that it's going to be way different. All right, then we...
Yes, good. So we've talked now a bit of the big picture, you know, the strategic view, you know, the high level. How about now going down one level? I think it's also very interesting for our audience, who are, most of them being very hands-on entrepreneurs, to talk, for instance, about the tactics that this is triggering. You know, you have these different framework, these different legal environment, these different cultures. What does it concretely trigger in terms of culture, in terms of tactics? Sorry.
Well, I think one place to start, Jordan, you mentioned this earlier, the idea of when you go to different regions, that means something different for you than it might for me. And Matan, you mentioned earlier that we don't necessarily need to think state by state when we're thinking language, or when we're thinking like, you know, micro cultures perhaps, but you know, it's a totally different concept there. So in terms of how that tactically differs, I might not have to do as many duplications of my campaigns for different languages as you might, Jordan. Or, you know, things like where on the flip side, if I needed to do a state type campaign, I might need to do 50 versions of it, whereas you might have less segmentation for your campaigns in different ways. So I would say things related to region and hyperlocal are a good place to think.
Yeah. Well, you know, one of the things as well in terms of execution is that when you want to launch in a new country in Europe, one of the main advice you can have, like for example, you can, let's say you are an e-commerce and you want to launch an ad in Germany and see if your product is good for the Germanic market. What you can do is just, you know, translate your ads and try to do something in the UK, for example. But usually, you know, people, they really advise you to work with someone from the country. And so in terms of recruitment, for example, this is like a really big topic, is that because we have so many differences in terms of culture. And, you know, one of the things is that, for example, in France, we have a specific type of humor, and in the UK they have another type of humor. And so if you want to you know, grab the attention of the audience with an ad using kind of fun copywriting, or you know, just translating your ad will not have the same impact as working with someone in the country that is going to change with the cultural approach as well. And so in terms of execution, then it means another cost in terms of recruitment, another it's the time frame is way longer, so it's just slower basically. It costs more money. And so usually, you know, so I can speak for the French market specifically because I know the French market, but if you see startups in France, when they raise money, one of the objectives they have when raising money is to go to another country in Europe, because usually you need to raise money to go to another country, where I think in the US, tell me if that's wrong, but I feel that you can go to another state without necessarily raising money, because anyway, it's going to be the same language, et cetera, et cetera. So you can already test things with a small amount of money.
Yeah, it strikes me actually in the US, an ideal strategy would probably involve some state-specific targeting. I mean, there are certainly cultures, and there are some examples, at least I can think of, like Manhattan Mini Storage has done famous ads in New York City for the last 15 years that really speak to and target what it's like to live in New York City. And you know, it's California and Arizona and all these different states with different cultures. But because it's not necessary, most companies don't do it. You know, because it's the same language that everyone speaks. There are sort of cultural groups, like you can have companies that realize Spanish speakers, for example, that's a potentially large market. So let's translate our advertising into Spanish. And that really depends on, you know, what areas of the United States you're in. But insofar as it's not really necessary, both, for people to understand your ads, or from a regulatory perspective, you know, people don't really do it.
Yeah, all right. And so one of the question we actually had, and I think was really interesting, is that you, Matan, went to YC twice actually. And so how do they feel would be the best tactics to go to one state to another, or do they give you advice on this type of thing? Like what's their opinion on this?
Not really, a little more over time. So I've done it twice. In 2013, it was a lot more hands-off than the most recent time. I just recently finished in March. You know, YC itself doesn't recommend any particular tactics, although I'll also say that a lot of YC is international now. So maybe more than 50% of the companies in the most recent batch were international companies. So there's, you know, a lot of companies like the Stripe for the Middle East, right? Or someone building like, you know, for the healthcare for the gig economy in India. So really specific stuff. And so I think their strategy or their advice there would be different. But I mean, at a high level, YC strategy is to really say, focus on one specific metric, grow that metric, you know, monitor it on a weekly basis. And you know, they rely on the founders to be clever enough to figure out how to grow. You know, it's really get to know your user, and insofar as your user is homogeneous, and you know, you can identify one specific type of user you're targeting initially, that simplifies a lot of the problem, right? And that would arguably be the same in Europe as well, insofar as like they would probably recommend get to know one user in one specific kind of country. But if you have one kind of user that is, you know, in multiple countries, it definitely makes it harder. And so I bet their advice would be focus first until you kind of saturate, and only then should you worry about going after other markets.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, I would agree. Definitely the one metric that matters methodology, hyper-focus. If it's international for your product, so be it. If it is domestic, so be it. But more so, the focus is independent, I would say, of international versus domestic there, for sure.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So we talk now about metrics, we talk about tactics. Shall we talk now about channels? You know, I think channels, actually they are global channels. The social media are basically global, but have to be localized. Do you see a difference in terms of using the key global channel like Facebook, Instagram, Google between Europe on the US, or at least you can speak on both sides on how you use it? How does that work? And also, is it preferable to use like local channels, like local social network or specialized social network, which can be geographical or targeting a specific community? So how do you basically create growth across all this array of touch points?
Yeah, so maybe I can start. So two things that are really interesting is that, so I will start, I guess I can make the link with what Chris and Matan were saying just earlier, the fact that you need to start small and to be really hyper-focused on this small thing and then try to expand. One of the most underrated strategy in terms of acquisition, I think today, still, because it was already the case 5 years ago, but I think still it's the Facebook groups. Because, you know, like first you start working on one specific audience. And so I always take this example when I teach to classes is like, if, for example, you build a product for vegetarians, like you have just in France, 10 Facebook groups for vegetarians. Like you have the vegetarian recipes, you have the vegetarian method, you have the vegetarian blah, blah, blah. And so by going into these groups, trying to understand the people and trying to activate them with your product and ask questions and feedbacks and blah, 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 because this is the power of a community and the power of a group of like-minded people that they want to share best practices and feedbacks and blah, blah, blah. It's just such a great place to start and to be like the king of the group, you know. So you want to take a big spot in this group, and then when you understand the group and etc., then you can expand to maybe another group, or so then you can start doing Facebook ads because you already know the value proposition that will convert people, and so blah blah blah. But other than that, I would say I don't know if it's the same in the US right now, but still Google, Facebook, Instagram, and now Snapchat, TikTok, for example, the big players, basically, they're still the big players in terms of acquisition. It's really hard to do any acquisition without thinking about them and without trying things on these platforms. One of the things that I identified that is really different from in Europe versus the US, because I had a really small experience in the US, and so this is something that really I was really surprised about. That is, influence marketing is such a different thing in Europe and in the US. Like I know, for example, in the US, influence marketing is a really big thing and can have a really big impact on business, especially in B2C. But for example, in France, like 5 years ago, I think it was a big thing, but I don't know why. Maybe because we don't have the right influencers, maybe because we don't have the right strategies, the right market, I don't know. But right now, influence marketing is not as big as it used to be. And for B2C, I really feel, tell me if I'm wrong, but I really feel that starting with influence marketing can be a really good starting point to build a growth strategy in the US, where in France or in Europe, it's not something so good, you know. It's more like awareness. You can do awareness using influence marketing. But so, you know, before investing in awareness, you want first to identify the right value proposition, to get some conversion, to get some turnover, and blah, blah, blah. So usually it's like a second or third step. Yeah.
Well, yeah, so that was a lot of good directions. So to react to some of that, first and foremost, the idea of the groups, that is definitely something that I've used very regularly because, as you said, by definition, someone is joining a community of like-minded X. Is it an interest? Is it a professional, job function? Is it a region? So to your point of groups being relevant, absolutely. I will say that it is one of the more challenging things I've experienced in my career to build community.
Yeah.
It's one thing to say, yes, that community is super valuable. Excuse me, the lights just went out here. It's one thing to say the community is super valuable, but it's difficult to dedicate the time and the energy and the resources to build trust in communities and Reddits.
Yep.
Unless you have that time, money, resources, and headcount for that. So I try to sort of use the benefit of a group and advertise to it or make a connection to the leader of these groups for partnerships, for affiliate opportunities, but yes to the groups. But I try to make it more linear, very campaign oriented than actually engendering the trust of an entire community, because that alone is a full-time job, is how I like to think about it. That said, if I'm understanding correctly, Jordan, you had mentioned some of this in our prior chat. There's a little bit of a difference between the offline communities in our respective regions.
Yeah.
To say that, what is very common for the US market, an association, a union, right? For example, this very community that we're presenting to today, these might not be as commonplace in the European nations, and I only speak, having learned that from you. So to that end, the same logic I mentioned about targeting groups applies even in the offline capacity, making connections with associations, unions. I did have one experience recently where part of our customer base was those types of groups, association leaders, things of that nature. And so it's just interesting to know that there's that difference between our cultures. Another type of online group that maybe has been a little more affected due to COVID, and maybe we'll touch on that maybe a little later, is a half digital, half physical version of this, which is a meetup group, right? Same idea, there's a digital entity with a leader. I might still want to shake that person's hand, but also do a digital business deal. Those are also gold mines for digital acquisition. And just to react to some of the other things you had shared, definitely Google and Facebook, and I would also add LinkedIn ads is a very regular tool in my tool shed. There are differences, of course, per platform. It's important to know what they are and treat them accordingly. Search ads are intent-based. I literally have a problem. I am typing words, looking for a solution to that problem. Very active, very high engagement rates, very costly. Social is more persona-based. I have this interest, I have this behavior. I might not be looking for this today, but I am the right person. Keep nurturing me, keep influencing me. So just treating them differently, and LinkedIn heavier on the business version of that, Facebook more on the personal version of that. But I'm sure there are cultural differences between them, but at the end of the day, those platforms they behave how they behave. And it's important to have a strategy that thinks through all of that for wherever your brand is, I would say.
Yeah. Thank you, Chris. Yeah, it was very insightful to dive a little bit deeper into the tactics, of growth hacking, and especially the platforms we can leverage for that. I would like now to focus on scaling. Scaling on how does it come, across the two continents. First of all, how is the cost? We mentioned different markets, different regulatory environment, maybe raising money to expand internationally in Europe, not necessarily in the US. Also, I think we have more and more fragmented consumers. So that might also, require some investment, to touch new target groups, people who might have very different behaviors or needs or aspirations. How do you approach that actually, the scaling on what are the key priorities, and at what cost does it come?
So one thing that has struck me recently about scaling, and I had this conversation with someone who was managing our Facebook ads recently, and she's seen startups scale from hundreds of dollars in Facebook ads to millions of dollars a month. That there is a cost associated with scale, right? You would think that the more money you spend, the more efficient you'd be able to be, and that isn't the case. It's hard work spending more money to scale, to acquire even like a similar percent of users, as you double, triple, 10x, 1,000x the amount of money you're putting in. And her point is that, if your customer acquisition cost only goes up 30% as you increase your spend from $1,000 to $10,000, that could be really good. It used to be the case actually that the algorithms were not as good as they are today. So Facebook advertising, for example, used to be having to think a lot about, okay, what specific targets and demographics should we be going after, and doing this critical thinking. Now it's actually a little bit more like, how can we feed as much data into the Facebook algorithm as possible so that it can make these decisions better than I could, right? And so we recently ran into a case where, I had initially set up at Ophelia our Facebook ads. So, identified, okay, all these different interest groups, maybe people interested in these kind of movies, male, female, what kind of age brackets can I look into, so I could identify where the lowest cost would be. And she said, you're getting too small with your groups. Facebook doesn't have enough data to learn about these people. If we go as broad as possible, we decided, okay, let's target Pennsylvania, let's target all genders, and let's target as wide of an age group as possible. And in my mind as a growth hacker, I think, well, that's sort of the opposite of how I'd been trained. But actually what Facebook's able to do then is on the back end, sort of in the black box of Facebook, they're able to really figure out who to go after and how to make it as cheap as possible. And we ended up, cutting our acquisition cost in half. And so it's strange because in many ways now, I don't know if I would say this about growth hacking generally, but certainly like paid advertising, the experts are the ones who understand how the algorithms work at an intuitive level, but can't really explain why they work that way. They just say, well, okay, you can't increase spend by more than this amount over this period of time. Otherwise the algorithm will punish you, right? As if it was like a living, breathing thing. But I think moving forward, it's going to really rely on understanding of the specifics of how each platform's like algorithm is built and the effectiveness of it.
Yeah, I agree. And I would add that for me, it's actually a pretty good thing, because then you can focus more on your value proposition, your creatives, etc. Because, before you had to really focus on trying to find the right audience and blah, 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 and, really be focused on the technical side of the work, where now you have to be focused on what you sell, basically, and trying to make it attractive to people. And so, and focus less on the technical side, because as you mentioned, the algorithm is becoming so good. And you mentioned Facebook, but it's the same in Snapchat and etc. In terms of scaling, I would simply add that, as we were mentioning before, the scaling opportunity in the US versus in Europe is not the same at all. And so because you have the same culture, the same language, blah, 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 when you identify something at the state level, you know it might probably work in the whole country level. And so you can spend more money and try, you know, to expand. When in Europe, when you want to scale, then you try to scale in France, and then you try to scale in Spain, and then you try to scale in Italy, and then blah, blah, blah. And so the cost of scaling added to what you were mentioning, the fact that, yeah, it's not going to be the same cost spending 100 euros versus 1 million euros doing ads. This cost is adding itself to this initial cost. So yeah, the potential is not the same. And this is why I think, for example, when we see fundings in the US versus in Europe, they're not the same at all. Like, this is not the same level of funding that you can get in the US, because investors, they know that in terms of scaling, the impact of the money they will give you will be, the impact will be way bigger. When again, in Europe, you have to launch France, and then you have to launch Germany, and then you have to launch the UK, and blah, blah, blah.
Right. Well, a couple things to add. We were talking about the difference in the scale, right? Just the bottom line difference in scale. There are 64 million, residents of France. There are 320 some odd million residents of the US. So on that principle, what we were riffing about was what is the hypothetical population of French speakers, or those that resonate with French culture, in this larger market, the US. And for example, that it looks to be 1.3 million people who speak French within the US, and within Canada, 7.4 or something to that effect. I say that to say the differences in regions and locations. We were talking about quality versus quantity. People seek out going to the US market because there's more dollars being spent, there's more scale. There are ways to still have an international product and have a beachhead, so to speak, and land and test within the US market and still be targeted, be hyper-targeted with that. The different things to consider are cost and quality. I just touched on the quality, and I say that sort of directionally, that the quality of traffic of US is better, more higher conversion rates than perhaps many international products, but I'm happy to be corrected there. But in terms of the cost per interaction, cost per click, that is a very real math thing, that the majority of countries have a cheaper cost per click than a US cost per click. Yep. So that is what I would say to be an advantage in certain aspects, right? Where yep. You get more squeeze out of the same dollar, so to speak. You're at least testing with more clicks. And on the flip side, what I mentioned earlier about international products testing within the US market, maybe directionally, one can find English speakers in other nations and get a cheaper cost per click. So things to consider, definitely quality and quantity when we're talking about EU versus US costs of scaling, I would say.
Sure.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is it's interesting that in the US, sort of China is the example of the country that has much higher scale. And I think especially over the last few years, we've been surprised, like the US tech market has been surprised by the scale at which some Chinese tech companies have been able to grow so quickly, just by virtue of the fact that it's, more than 3 times larger, right? So to have a product in China that reaches hundreds of millions of users in several months it's certainly possible. And it's in the US, we've struggled to break into a market like China because of how different it is culturally. India is a little bit harder to reach just because there's not as much, I would say, homogeneity in the market as in the Chinese market, but not having firsthand experience, I don't know that for certain.
Yeah, No, absolutely. China is definitely a big market. I mean, it's been growing also in maturity. There are also local players that are pretty fierce. They've been also their own ecosystem, but obviously it's the largest potential outside US, I would guess. Maybe to, because we're getting on the top of the hour, I would like to go through the future. You know, where are things going? We see, for instance, in Europe, there is more and more of a bad perception from a large technology company, you know, around privacy. So Google, Facebook are a bit on the spotlight for that. How do you see that affecting actually the future? Yeah, basically, yeah, maybe you can give a few words on how you see the future. What are the main factors that will impact the coming years in growth hacking?
Well, if I can just quickly say that I'm always a firm believer, no matter the where, on keeping the user experience simple. That leads to more growth, better conversion rates, higher likelihood that someone will give you that information, spend that dollar with you, etc. So, as I mentioned up front, the concept of GDPR equals more privacy concerns, equals more barriers, equals this sort of what I would perceive to be, from a growth perspective, a negative effect on your process. It's a slight dip, it's a slight disadvantage. And so how I feel about US versus Europe would only say anytime that the user experience is affected in one region versus another, that's going to be, you know, a disadvantage, I would say. So that's how I see this pretty simply in that way, the user experience part.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, doing growth hacking well always relies on like a ton of experimentation and learning and being aware of new things. So insofar as, you know, there are always new platforms to learn about that people are using and switching to, and the relative undervaluation or overvaluation of acquisition channels is constantly changing. It means there are no rules, right? The things that have worked for the last few years stop working. And so you always have to be willing to dive in and try to figure out, like, how do you do advertising on sort of new platforms? You know, what does TikTok look like, right? What does Clubhouse advertising look like? Or, you know, marketing through those channels. They might not even have advertising in all the channels. And I don't think that's changed. I think maybe what's changed is there's more fragmentation. So maybe it used to be that it was one of these platforms served the needs of many people, and now people get tired of one platform and so now 10 are spawned in its place. So it might get harder for you to identify really where it's worth focusing your time. But I think you probably could have said that, you know, 10 years ago as well. It's just that now with hindsight, it's more obvious.
Yeah, I would simply say that GDPR will help people with their privacy, etc. And so the tactics you could use like 10 years ago are not the same at all than what's working today. But as long as you're focusing on bringing value to the user and the customers, etc., and by respecting the rules, basically, then you will always find a way to do business. Because still, at the end of the day, what you want is to bring value to people and to be easy to use and to be cool to use, or I don't know, but yeah, still, I think, again, same way as, you know, algorithm is working so well right now that you don't have to focus on the technical side of the channel the acquisition channels, and that brings you should focus on the value proposition. I think it's going to go this way even in 2 years, like more privacy. All right, let's build a better product and have a better value proposition, because then the tactics, then we won't be able to use the same tactic as today. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Great. On just the current topic, do you see coronavirus on the current situation, both in the US and Europe, and actually going around the world, impacting growth hacking strategies?
Yeah, so I definitely wanted to make a quick comment on this. So I have worked with many different types of companies, B2C, B2B, online SaaS products versus e-commerce. There's definitely some obvious trends going on. For starters, anything relying on a physical type of business or experience is certainly affected. You see that on CNBC. That isn't much news, but from a growth and marketing perspective, it's important to consider what was once a certain cost is going to be costlier. What was once a certain expectation is now less so. Businesses like physical retail, travel, air, hotels, sports, events, anything relating to a conference, music, all taken a downtick. On the flip side, all things that are clearly online heavy have seen an uptick. Things like delivery items, food delivery, e-commerce, and yes, online B2B SaaS products. I would say at the very least, I haven't seen a prominent dip outside of maybe the same way a market had a knee-jerk dip reaction in March and April. But that is, even that is normalizing. So it's important to understand that what you see in the news and the stocks will have a correlating effect to your digital, your growth efforts. And I definitely have seen one specific case study of food delivery having a boom as a result of this. And so budgets, allocations are changing. You know, what was once an event conference budget is now put towards digital marketing. So that's how I would see real changes and impact from the coronavirus from my view. I know, Jordan, you had mentioned things about, in general, sort of venture as a whole, almost no matter the region, has taken a bit of a dip.
Well, you know, actually, I completely agree with you. So I feel that we see the same trends in Europe. So I don't think I can add anything because I completely agree and I see the same trends. So yeah, I think we should move on to the questions.
Yeah, so we have one question from Gina, which is around how to choose a country to expand to. Either you're in the US, want to expand to Europe, or you're in Europe, want to expand in other countries. What criteria, how would you rate actually the countries?
Well, if I speak for Europe, because, you know, when you want to scale to Europe, you have to go to another country straight away. So, you know, it all depends, because I know I see in the questions there are examples like regulatory, tax, financial, demographics, etc. I think it all depends on the products, actually, because, you know, many of the products we see, usually, like, for example, e-commerce, like really general brands, like you sell you work in the clothing industry, like everybody wear clothes. So usually it's in terms of demographics, like, because, you know, all right, next country, I'm going to go to the country with the bigger impact on my business. But usually, especially for B2B, etc., because the cultures are really different, so you need to think about the regulatory, or is it the same kind of, do we have the same kind of business approaches in Germany and in France, or blah, blah, blah. Like, for example, last week, a startup raised $70 million in France to expand. And actually, they didn't expand to Europe, they expanded to Brazil. And so, you know, I thought, like, oh, that's funny, but, you know, this is a really specific product, like regarding to pay restaurants, it's B2B companies, blah, blah, blah. I'm not gonna go into the details, but, you know, it's really fun to think that they might have gone to Brazil because this is the country closest to France for this type of business. So yeah, it's a bit weird, but it all depends on the product, basically.
I would say in our product, so in healthcare where there are state-specific regulations, the things that we look into when deciding what to expand into are the market. So like what's the sort of the market size there, how much could we charge, what the price of the alternatives are, and partnership potential, the competition, so who else is there in that market, as well as, you know, in our case, what's the black market look like, and then the regulatory side. So, you know, what are the laws around regulation, what's the licensing timeline, and what it would take to go into that. We don't have to think about, you know, culture or language barriers there, but I imagine depending on the product, there would be, you know, some additional factors there as well.
And for my efforts predominantly in the English language in the US market, when we're thinking about expanding, we'd like to get the most bang for our buck, which is to say, how can I replicate this already existing creative, this already existing copywriting, and test another market, acknowledging cultural differences in these markets, but hoping there are enough similarities on the language alone. We focus on US speaking nation expansion first and foremost. So from the US, including UK, Canada, Australia, South Africa, Ireland, New Zealand. We test those markets pretty much as an expansion to what we're already doing. Beyond that, it would require translation.
Yeah. Great. So guys, thank you so much. I think we are at the top of the hour. I really want to thank you very warmly for taking part in this first panel from the Columbia Venture Community European chapter. We learned a lot today, you know, around the growth tactics, how to use the different platforms and channels, how to make sure we leverage the technology in the right way, we have the right content, how we address specific audience, how we use the right channel. So yeah, it was a real pleasure to facilitate this conversation. Thank you for your great insights, and I hope we speak again soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.